Hey everybody, International Master Danny Rensch here for Chess.com's YouTube channel, and today I wanted to start a new series on the topic of chess strategy as a general umbrella to talk to you about pawns and pawn vocabulary, the recognition of pawn weaknesses and pawn strengths, and in general just everything concerning the little guys of chess. Let's go ahead and get started. In part one, our main goal is to basically improve our pawn vocabulary, the ability to look at a chessboard and recognize what is and what isn't a pawn weakness. The first and most common type of pawn weakness that occurs in a lot of chess games are doubled pawns. A doubled pawn is anytime you have two pawns stacked on top of each other where one pawn left another file via capture. Double pawns cannot happen outside of capture to land right on top of a brother pawn like this. Now, double pawns are not always the worst thing in the world because by definition, when you left a file, that left an open file for other pieces. What pieces love open files? Ding, 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 rook. You're a genius, aren't you? So sometimes capturing toward the center in a situation where you open up a rook, or capturing away from the center in a position that might open up a file in the center of the board can be advantageous to you. But double pawns themselves are never a good thing. They don't protect each other. They step on each other's toes as you try to advance up the board. And if they're isolated, when you look over to the E file here, which means they're doubled, so they got on top of each other one way or another via capture, but there are no pawns around them to help protect them, like there are here with the C pawn protecting the B pawn, that means these particular doubled pawns are very weak, and usually sitting ducks targets for the enemy pieces. So if we had to rank doubled pawns from worst to best, we would say that the worst type of doubled pawns are isolated. I guess you could say tripled pawns, possibly, if you ever had 3 or even 4 pawns I've seen stacked on top of each other, but those cases are much more rare. So double pawns that are isolated are really a problem, and by themselves never really a good thing, though even in those cases, by definition, you do usually have open files because you wouldn't have double pawns if you hadn't captured from one file to another. Doubled pawns that still have the protection of another pawn and are basically still a part of a larger pawn mass are not necessarily great in and of themselves, but they're really not that bad either. In comparison, you see two healthy pawns right next to each other can advance up the board, protecting each other, and that's why healthy pawns are always better than unhealthy pawns. Let's talk about the next pawn weakness. Here we're going to talk about the isolated pawn. Particularly, it's on the D file. I'm going to quickly show you an opening right after we introduce all three of the pawn weaknesses I'm trying to get across today that can commonly reach an isolated queen pawn. Usually a pawn on the D file is referred to as an IQP, isolated queen pawn. An isolated pawn by definition is, well, isolated, right? All alone, meaning there are no pawns on the adjacent files. The pawn itself is never, again, like double pawns, if you're evaluating just the unbiased factors of the pawn itself, it's not great. It's alone and it can only be protected by the pieces. But generally, when you have an isolated pawn, you have open files, and usually that pawn is actually advanced far enough that it's kind of an asset in the center. It controls critical squares. Often you have a little bit more space, and you can even use the diagonals around the pawn to potentially create attacking chances. Many times isolated queen pawn positions are very dynamic and double-edged. Lots of good play for both sides. So an isolated pawn itself, again, never that great. But an isolated pawn in a middle game where there are lots of pieces can actually not be the worst thing in the world. The final type of pawn weakness I want to point out today, which again, the first part here, part one, our first installment is all about learning to look at a chessboard and recognize pawn weaknesses. In the bigger picture, all this knowledge is going to be really useful for you guys because one thing a chess player needs is the skill to look at a chessboard and sort of see the forest through the trees, see the bigger picture, the smoke through the mirrors, if you will. And so you're not always caught up on all the tactics of the pieces, but your ability to sort of see where the position might be headed is based on what long-term weaknesses you have. And pawns are always dictating those factors because pawns are the only pieces that can't go back. So everything they do is technically long-term. So again, in other parts, we're going to look at the pawn assets and eventually look at pawn play. And these are very quick snippets to a much longer-running video series I actually have over on Chess.com, which is Pawn Structure 101. So there's a long-standing, much more in-depth video series here. This is sort of fast-paced and just sort of hit you in the noggin and knock you out and give you a little more knowledge. But anyway, I'm just trying to tell you that so that you have an idea of why exactly it is you're looking at a chessboard with no other pieces besides the pawns. And so in this case, we set up one enemy pawn just to highlight the third and final weakness of today's video, which is that the pawn on b2 is a backward pawn. A backward pawn, by definition, is a pawn that cannot advance due to capture. Moving it once would run into a capture here, whereas moving it twice would run into capture via en passant. In passing. If you don't know what en passant is, then check out our YouTube video lectures, and I believe we have a video describing en passant. One move would allow regular capture, while 2 moves would allow capture via en passant, a backward pawn that is actually on an open file and the target to enemy pieces like a rook is a really big weakness, almost just as bad as an isolated pawn or even isolated double pawn. So a backward pawn is not something you want, but it does happen commonly in structures. One extreme case of backward pawns might be something like this, where you see that the one black pawn on b4, technically, if you were evaluating this unbiasedly, forgetting about the fact that the position here is completely illegal almost and highly improbable, you would, if you're just looking at the pawns, you would see that 1 move allows a capture, 2 move, again, en passant. The same on this side of the board, which means essentially this pawn on b4 is worth just as much as all 3 of these pawns, if not for other factors. So that's not really practical because there are always other factors, but your ability to look at pawn weaknesses and see the future of a position is maybe based on looking at weaknesses and weak squares surrounding pawns like this. And so this type of knowledge and the ability to recognize double pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns can be really useful. In part 2, what we'll do is we'll show practical examples of how double pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns can occur quickly in very common openings that you may be playing right now and you didn't even know it, right? So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this video here on our YouTube channel. If anybody's wondering about my live sessions and bullet brawls, I decided to start letting people know that you can follow me on Twitter at Daniel Rensch, and I usually make announcements when I'm going to be playing those sessions over on Chess.com. So if you want to follow or even have a chance to be a part of one of those games, go ahead and do that. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.